Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to this press conference this morning. It's a joint press conference with Mrs. Marine Le Pen. I'd like to welcome you this morning. We only have half an hour, so we will try to keep our statements very brief to give you a chance to ask as many questions as you want. By way of introduction, I'd just like to say that the agenda for this plenary session reflects a lot of the problems that we as Eurosceptics want to highlight. There are 2 points I'd like to mention here. There's a vote in a few minutes about Lampedusa. As you all know, that is just the tip of an iceberg, a problem that's been known for many years now. We know that tens of thousands of people have died since the 1980s in the Mediterranean. And it's been said that the member states haven't been doing enough. We are only dealing with emergencies as they arise. We're acting as though there isn't a problem. Now, whenever we think about Eurosur and other measures, we could also provide support off the North African coast. We can see that ships get into distress, and support could be provided for those. So help is good, but it can't just automatically mean that anyone who tries to get here, we've seen millions try to do that over the past few years, we just can't say that they should have a guaranteed access to Europe. The Northern African states need to be involved as well. They need to recognise their responsibilities, monitoring the coasts and so on. That's important. Over the past few years, we have neglected the reasons for these migration flows. We, Europeans, are very interested in exploiting and using resources. And we need to make sure that the people are given the conditions to want to continue to live in their countries. Europe needs to tackle that. That's one of the key activities that we need to be involved in. We need to tackle those problems. So we're talking about different symptoms. We're talking about short-term measures as to whether or not the people can be given honorary citizenship or whatever. But we're not looking at how to address the problem in the long term. This is what we need to stress here. Illegal does not mean legal. And if people can't arrive in a legal way, then they should be sent back. We have seen the route that's been taken. We've seen a point that was referring to the sovereignty of states. You can have different opinions on different topics, but when we're thinking about regulation, we need to look at various different policies. We need to look at the way in which countries need to take action in social policy and health policy and so on. These are some things that we have a negative view of. The citizens don't understand why their rights are being affected, why sovereignty is being attacked. Where Europe should be strong, it should do that. But we don't think that you should introduce regulation when it's not necessary. So just to end this brief introductory statement, we don't have much time. I want to give you time to ask some questions, and I'll give the floor to Mrs. Le Pen.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we felt that we had to organize a press conference because there were so many requests for interviews that it was almost impossible in a reasonable time to be able to meet them. Because often we realize that the subjects asked are subjects of concern that are common or are very close to everything the international press is concerned with. So we'll move on to your questions quickly so that we can try to give you the information you want on all the subjects that are of concern to you.
Qui se lance, ouais.
So, who wants to break the ice?
Kuschler.
Teresa Kuschler. Svenska Dagbladet in Sweden. I've got a question on this future party, this future group here in the European Parliament on the right. Are you already in contact with other parties in order to drop a list of interested parties? And among them, is our Sverigedemokraterna to be found, the Swedish party, and would you be president of the group?
The speaker needs a microphone.
Pour Madame Le Pen.
Ah, c'est pour moi?
Excusez-moi. Oui, pour Madame Le Pen.
Yes, it's for Mrs. Le Pen. Would you be president of this group if it were created? Well, as you know, of course, we do nurse the hope of setting up a group in the European Parliament, especially because we're suffering from our position as non-attached, so that we are only, well, demi-members, if you think, because there are all kinds of things that we can't do, like table limits as a group. So if you have a group, you have the means to act, to really bring influence to bear. So we have the hope of being able to set up a group, and we've had this hope for several months. We've been consulting people, we're contacting a lot of people around this European Alliance for Freedom. This is a European party. And of course, and as long as the EP doesn't change the rules for the groups, because of course it might do that, to try to prevent the Eurosceptics from being able to set up a group and really bring their weight to bear in the debate. But I hope and I'm optimistic that we'll be able to set up a group that is to get together at least 7 nationalities and 25 members, and to say that it's impossible, of course, already now to talk about who might be chair of that group. That's very hypothetical. For the moment, let's work upstream, if you will, in terms of setting up this group. Let's think together about the concerns that we share, we patriotic parties in Europe, on the solutions that we might present together, and then afterwards we'll have the time, once this political group will set up, to determine who might be the chair.
Oui, excusez-moi, je fais un coup comme ça, non? Monsieur?
Yes, go ahead up there.
Oui, David Carretta.
David Carretta, Radio Kelly, Mrs. Le Pen, I'd like to ask you, like my colleague, with whom you want to cooperate, because the question is important also for voters. The day they're going to vote for the National Front in France or for other parties in the rest of Europe, they want to know with whom you're going to make alliances. This is true for the Italians, if the Lega Norte is amongst them. So how are you going to manage the present alliances of the National Front in Europe? The speaker has a microphone.
Les futurs.
Well, any future alliances of the National Front in Europe are already pretty clear because, well, the embryo, whatever you say, of a European group is already made up of this European Alliance for Freedom. Let's be clear. We have close relations with the FPE in Austria, with the Sverigedemokrats in Sweden, with the Flamsk Belang in Belgium. So, of course, this shows our hopes. And, well, I see what you mean. The question you asked is, with whom do you not want to have an alliance rather than with whom you do? So the European Alliance for Freedom didn't want predicaments which we think have ideas which are very different from ours, of course, that's clear. So in the group, we want. I think it's better to lecture groups like that. That's not the kind of line that we want to follow. They don't have the same political ideas as we do. And then afterwards, we're working on it. In November, I'm going to the Netherlands to meet Geert Wilders, who I already met in Paris, to discuss things with him. All of this is set up gradually and based on trust, because we have to have trust between the different movements. We've got a charter in our European Alliance for Freedom which determines the main fundamental principles of our political action at European level. I mean, you can look at our site and you'll understand that there are certain movements that maybe tomorrow will get a lot of support, like Mr. Wilders' party, I hope, and that might be able to ally with us, agree with us. Yes, go ahead.
Sanna Trygg from Skånska Dagbladet in Sweden. I have a question concerning the Swedish Democrats as well. How do you cooperate with them today, and how are your plans for the future?
Well, I did meet the president of the Sverigedemokrats, the Swedish Democrats, very briefly when I visited Sweden last weekend. And in the European Alliance for Freedom, we have Kenneth Roth as a member, whom you know, and with whom we do work on subjects which concern the future of Europe, and with whom we do have a lot in common on the things we note and on the absolute necessity of shoring up our national sovereignty, to giving answers to loss of sovereignty in our own countries in this European Union, which comes along to impose its ideas against the opinion of the people. So we've been working for some time with Kenneth Roth, and I hope that this work will be successful.
Oui, mademoiselle.
Oui, bonjour.
Yes, I'd like to know your point of view about the Catalonian independence. That's it's a large people's movement, and about in your new party, whether you're going to include the Catalan Patriots as well.
Pour l'instant, nous n'avons.
Well, for the moment, we don't have any relations with the Spanish political movements, but I hope that'll change. And there are some countries where the Eurosceptic movements have trouble coming out or getting federated. So we hope that maybe this will be able to be done during the European campaign, but for the moment we don't have any contacts with Spanish movements.
Oui, Alberto.
You talk about the likely good results in the Netherlands. Now, in Italy, we'll probably Pepe Grillo's five-star movement will probably have good results. So now they have a position against the euro. Would you like to ally yourselves with them or not?
J'ai du mal à.
Well, I really don't understand the consistency of Pepe Grillo's political plans, perhaps because it's such a new movement. I'm pleased to see that any political representative who expresses that he disagrees with the single currency, which I think is the cause of a lot of the economic malaise in a lot of European countries. That's clear, but maybe that's not enough, though. We also have to have a global vision of the Europe that we want to build together, because we think that this European Union is running out of breath. But tomorrow we're going to have the responsibility of providing solutions so that we can have a Europe that we love, of course, but of free nations. So let's leave it up to Mr. Grillo to think about the subject himself, to give its some consistency. And then the day that he comes along with that, well, of course, we'll look at his platform and see whether we have things in common.
Oui, Madame Le Pen, Christian
Christian from FP. Well, you explained the main lines in a future European group. You don't want to alliance with Jobbik or done. So I have a problem because, well, you are 3 members of the National Front. You're in the European Alliance for Freedom, but your father and Mr. Golnisch are in alliance with Jobbik. So I'd like to know, what are you going to do if you have to form a group? Will the National Front be split up between those who are with you? I mean, is your father going to be excluded from the National Front and the European Alliance for Freedom, or is he going to join? This seems like a trend. But you're in 2 parties which are pretty different. One with parties that you don't want to deal with, and your father with those that you don't like. So it's a problem. Well, you're absolutely right to ask that question. You're putting the finger on a problem. Now, this problem existed before I headed up the National Front. Now, the National Front resigned from the Nationalist Movement Alliance, where my father's a member, and I joined the European Alliance for Freedom. Now, I understand, of course, and even before you said so, this situation couldn't last, or that it was inconsistent and illogical. And since we're going to be joining a European campaign, I asked Bruno Gollnisch and Jean-Marie Le Pen to leave the Alliance for National Movements so that we could have consistency in the National Front in our choice of alliances, so that that could be clear in the European campaign. And given that Jean-Marie Le Pen and Gollnisch are candidates for the elections, it would have been totally incomprehensible for them to stay in a movement which was different from the one that the president of the National Front is choosing, and of a group which tomorrow will be chosen by the whole National Front and by all of the voters or candidates who will have been elected on the ticket of the National Front to the European Parliament. So this is being done right now. Yes, we're in the process.
Vous aurez d'ailleurs des...
And you'll get information about this very quickly.
de clarification.
You'll get clarification.
Oui, monsieur.
Sono Dario Cirincione di...
From Sky DG24. If you were in the position of Commissioner Malmström, how would you deal with the issue of migrants landing in Lampedusa, and what specific action would you have taken?
Je suis allé,
Well, 2 years ago I went to Lampedusa. And as Mr. Mayer said, that this problem isn't new. I said so too. It's long-standing, and I said that those who lead these people to think that by risking their lives they can be granted a right of asylum on European territory have the moral responsibility of those who are going to make the same attempt at the risk of losing their lives because they are misled in this way into believing that they can obtain the right to remain in Europe or a nationality of one of the European countries once they arrive alive on our shores. So I find that inhuman and politically irresponsible. So I already suggested then. Now, I don't believe in the capacity of the European Union to solve this problem because the European Union is following an ideology of more immigration. The EU wants to bring into the EU 150 million immigrants in coming years. So we disagree with them totally. So I suggested there be a force of cooperation between the countries who share coasts, like Spain and Italy and France, with these countries, in order to seize it under proper conditions of safety, these boats with these immigrants, in order to safely bring them to the shores they've departed from. And like Mr. Obama said, in our international relations, we are certainly going to continue discussing and thinking and organizing things with these countries that these people are coming from. We're going to be discussing a real policy to combat illegal immigration and a policy of economic development in these countries in order so that these people can stay in their countries of origin. I would remind you that when the Libyans leave to flee war, we're responsible for that war too. We've contributed to putting Islamic fundamentalists at the head of the government of Libya, and they have applied Sharia law to religious minorities. And so now people want the right of asylum in Europe because they're being persecuted by a government that we contributed to putting in place in Libya. So it's time to ask the question if the people who govern us are really reasonable, if there's any consistency in their international policy, and if they really tomorrow aren't going to aggravate the situation even more of these migratory flows, where I said that this is going to be the problem of the 21st century.
Attendez, je vais d'abord donner la parole à madame parce que vous avez déjà posé une question.
Well, you've already asked a question, so I'll let this lady up here talk. I'm from Spain. In the list of parties that I've heard you say that you want contacts with, you didn't seem to have included any UK party. I don't know if the British Eurosceptics couldn't be allied with you?
Bon, c'est pas tout à fait.
Well, that's not quite true, because we do have contacts, especially with a member of UKIP. But I have the impression, I mean, you're talking about UKIP, I'm sure, that UKIP is a young movement. Young and maybe doesn't have the maturity of our more established movements. UKIP seems to be afraid of the image they have. I mean, every time that we are opposed to the system defended by the EU, we're stigmatized. We're victims of defamation and various pressures. Now, UKIP has the impression, undoubtedly, that they're already so stigmatized that there's no point of subjecting themselves even further to the other movements who suffer from the same thing, the National Front, the FPÖ, etc. So let's let time work. And I think UKIP will realize that it's in a federation that you find strength against the European Union, and that's how we'll go down in history. And if they don't understand that, well, too bad. Too bad. I mean, it's been suggested around me that UKIP would refuse to join the European Alliance for Freedom or to be in a group with us just so that they can keep the chairmanship of a group. Well, I hope it's not true, because if that were the case, that would seem, well, details in terms with our historic importance, the historic responsibility of our patriotic parties in the months and years to come.
Well, just one additional point here for our colleagues. The founder for our alliance was a UKIP member, Godfrey Bloom, for example. So I think that a lot of things are changing in English politics. And I think after the elections, we'll just see which partners look like potential partners and which could be good partners.
Oui, en effet, les résultats.
Yes. Of course, the results of the election will undoubtedly have consequences on the choices that might be made by both sides.
En anglais, por favor. Pelle Zachrisson, tidningen Härjedalen, Sweden.
I'm from Sweden.
What would you tell a voter why should a voter vote for one of the parties in your coalition, the coming coalition? And the second question, what do you tell those people who claim that your parties are Islamophobic and racist?
Vaste question, cher monsieur.
Well, that's a vast question that you're putting to me. What to say to a voter so that he votes for the Patriotic parties, well, ask the question if they want to remain a free people. Do they want to remain a people with democratic functions? Because when we see what we see in the European Union, the aspiration for sovereignty of the people, now, with the complicity of our leaders, of course, we see what's happening with loss of sovereignty. Now, what's happening in terms of the penal code in France is not, the people aren't informed of it. So, and we don't have a migration policy. It's the European Union decides. We don't have any legislative sovereignty. If the people wants to pass a law, if they're contrary to a European directive, well, it's the European directive that applies, not the will of the people. That's not what I call democracy. We don't have any sovereignty, for some of us, in terms of budgets, and in terms of our currency, monetary terms. We're people who are slaves, if you will. We can't decide on our own fate. We can't control our own destiny. And we're all, as European peoples, attached to freedoms, to our sovereignty. So the only movements that denounce the situation that exists and wants to return the sovereignty that's been stolen to the people are our patriotic movement. Otherwise, we have no Islamophobic tendencies. That's a term which was constructed so that we couldn't talk about Islamic fundamentalism. I mean, there's one thing, there's Islam on one hand and the fundamentalism on the other hand. Fundamentalism is totalitarianism, which wants to force men and women to make individual freedoms disappear. Everybody ought to fight against Islamic fundamentalism. That has nothing to do with the Islamic religion. So I don't like this term Islamophobic. I protest against it. As to racism, it is an accusation which was fabricated just because we want to control immigration. I mean, this is the very least of things. When you have a home, for example, to have the choice of saying yes or no. Today it's no longer the case, and I don't see why the fact of wanting to control immigration and immigration policy, and then depending on periods wanting to limit it, that means that we're racist. Certainly not. We are profoundly attached to the nation and nationality, whatever the origin, the color, the religion, or whatever other difference might exist between peoples. Yes.
The reporter, comment vous voyez le...
How do you see the global challenge of China, for example, in globalization, if European states function separately? And how can France face up to that challenge all alone?
Tout seul.
I mean, why all alone?
C'est quand même drôle parce que...
I mean, why do you say that? I mean, when we listen to these terms, you get the impression that in the history of France, or for the future France, will either be stuck in a European Union without any power, or will be in the world and have nothing to say. But I mean, we've got thousands of years of history, and 95% of the nations of the world are free. 95% of the nations of the world can control their own currency. 95.9% of France was that. And it's never prevented France from being powerful. It's never prevented France from being able to trade or from having influence, and which was very important in the past when it had its own voice. Then today, once its voice is covered up by Mrs. Ashton's voice. So I don't think that we're looking for isolation. We're looking for freedom. Freedom isn't isolation. Sovereignty isn't isolation. And I might say that, well, vis-a-vis China, the European Union certainly hasn't demonstrated its capacities because our economic sectors are being undermined by massive imports coming from China. And other countries of low labor costs, low production costs. I mean, in France, companies are closing because of relocating, etc. Today, the Eurozone is the only zone in the world that's still in recession 5 years after the financial crisis. So I think we have to look at the state of the art. We have to show that the European Union hasn't met the needs of the people. It hasn't been capable of protecting the people, nor of carrying out, preventing the surveillance by the NSA. It hasn't been able to control migratory flows. It hasn't prevented the impoverishment of our populations or the sharp increase in unemployment, which has become endemic in the European Union, and all kinds of other things. And we have to draw conclusions from that because, okay, we can see what's happened, but then we have to draw conclusions from that. Yes?
Madame Le Pen, un nouveau parti.
New possible party of the extreme right? How will that be? Oh, I can't hear you, sorry.
Un nouveau parti.
A new party on the right or the extreme right in Europe. How will that be different from the ITS, the Golnish party, the one Golnish was president of in the past? Well, the members won't be the same. That's the first thing. So, I mean, a group is made up based on the identity of its members and based on a political platform. And we are patriots, sovereigntists, so we don't want to enclose our members in some kind of single program. Everybody will defend the interests of its own people, because if we didn't do this, we wouldn't be fulfilling the promises we've been making to our different peoples. But as a European people, we have interests in common. And well, of course, the members won't be the same. Well, then, by definition, the group isn't the same. And I would remind you, too, that I firmly contest this term extreme right. I don't see why we'd be on the right of the right. I certainly don't feel to the right of the UMP, because I'd be then even more ultra-liberal than the UMP, and I'm not. I'd be even more in favor of helping those who have the least need of it, and I'd be not helping those who need protection. So I really contest this term of extreme right. This is something that's pejorative and which is deliberately used by our political opponents to stigmatize us. So if you don't agree with the existing system, immediately you're stamped extreme right. And then, well, you're just stigmatized totally extreme right. Mr. Brezhnev, terrorism, fundamentalists, Chechenians, Boston terrorists. You shake all that up, and then you say that you're the parties of the opposition, that is, our patriotic parties, are something that are just against this. Well, I'm not saying anything in our political platform which is extremist.
Well, I'd just like to make a proposal here. Let's just forget about left and right. That's okay for football. You can talk about the left wing, the right wing, and so on. When I read the Austrian press, when I read what they say about my party, they're saying good things, is saying that we are looking at social policies that actually would go more on the left. So this left-right, just leave it for football, but not for parties.
L'Union européenne.
Well, the European Union is only firm with its own MEPs. So, I mean, I'm afraid we're reaching the end. We have to leave the room, and I'm sorry for those who haven't been able to ask any questions.